There is a place at the edge of the visible universe where, according to one of the oldest religious texts ever recovered, 7 stars are chained to the ground. Not stars in the poetic sense, not a metaphor for angels, not a turn of phrase. The text describes them as burning, as enormous, as bound, held in a location it calls the end of heaven and earth, a place with no floor, no sky, no water, nothing but fire and darkness stretching in every direction. And the text is specific about why they're there. They arrived late. That's the crime. Not rebellion in the way we usually imagine it. Not war in heaven. A group of stars simply failed to rise at the moment they were assigned to rise. And for that, according to the Book of Enoch, they were seized and locked away in a prison built specifically to hold them, for a sentence the text implies is still running. Right now, as far as this text is concerned, that prison is still occupied. To understand why that detail is stranger than it sounds, you have to understand what Enoch claims happened to him. According to the text, he wasn't just told about the heavens in a vision. He says he was physically carried through them, on a journey with a guide, moving from one location to the next, the way a tourist moves through a city. Except the city is the architecture of the universe itself, and the guide is an angel who apparently gets irritated when Enoch asks too many questions. The stars come up early in that journey. Enoch describes reaching a wasteland at what the text calls the extremity of the earth. No ground beneath it, no sky above it, nothing recognizable as a normal place at all. And there, he says, he saw them. 7 stars, described as being like great burning mountains, bound together in that empty space. He asks his guide what he's looking at. The angel's answer is not comforting. This, the angel tells him, is the prison for the stars and the host of heaven, a location that will hold them until the end of heaven and earth itself. Not a temporary holding cell, not a warning shot, a sentence with no defined release date, tied to a timeline that hasn't happened yet. And Enoch doesn't get to just hear about it and move on. The text says the angel accompanying him grows sharp when Enoch keeps pressing for more. A small detail, but a telling one. Whatever this place is, it isn't meant for casual sightseeing. Enoch is being shown something he was not necessarily supposed to fully understand, and the guide's irritation reads less like a tour guide's fatigue and more like someone standing too close to a door that isn't meant to be opened by visitors. Before this vision, Enoch had already been shown other, stranger regions of the same landscape. Rivers of literal fire pouring into a great sea, a river of liquid flame flowing like water, and mountains of darkness marking the edge of winter itself, where he says the waters of every abyss on earth begin. This isn't a single isolated prison sitting alone in the void. It's one stop in a much larger architecture, a landscape built, according to the text, entirely out of consequence. Every region Enoch passes through seems to exist because something happened there, or something is being held there, which makes the star's prison land differently once you see where it sits. It isn't an anomaly in the landscape. It's the landscape's logic taken to its most literal extreme. Order maintained by confinement, on a scale large enough to include the sky itself. Sit with the logic of that for a second, because it's the detail almost nobody stops to examine. If the release condition is the end of heaven and earth, by every account, religious or otherwise, are still here, then the text is making an implicit claim that most readers skim straight past. Whatever is bound in that place has not been released. Not metaphorically. Structurally, According to the text's own internal rules, it can't have been. The sentence hasn't run out because the condition for it running out hasn't happened. Which raises the obvious question: what exactly did they do? The text doesn't leave you guessing for long, and the answer is almost anticlimactic compared to what you'd expect from a punishment this severe. These are described as stars that transgressed the commandment of God at the beginning of their rising, because they did not come forth at their appointed times. They were late. Now, before you write that off as a strange bit of ancient poetry, it's worth understanding what late would have meant to the people who wrote this text. In the world of Second Temple Judaism, when this material was composed, the movement of the stars wasn't decoration, it was infrastructure. Other sections of the same book, sections dealing with what's called the astronomical framework, describe an entire administrative system running the sky. Winds with their own storehouses, lightning and thunder with their own treasuries. A precise calendar keeping the stars, sun, and moon locked to a schedule. In that worldview, a star that doesn't rise on time isn't behaving strangely. It's committing a structural failure in a machine that the rest of creation depends on running correctly. That's the frame you need to understand why the punishment is so severe. This isn't a myth about disobedient light in the sky. It's a myth about something responsible for cosmic order breaking that order. And creation itself is described as depending on it not happening again. To see how seriously the text takes this, look at how much space it spends on the machinery of the sky before it ever gets to the prison itself. Enoch describes storehouses for the winds, sealed like vaults, distributing weather across the earth in a fixed, deliberate order. He describes treasuries holding hail, mist, and cloud, each with its own place, each released only as intended. He describes the pillars of heaven, the winds that physically hold the sky and earth apart, keeping them from collapsing into each other. None of this is background scenery. It's a working system, described with the precision of an engineer walking you through a piece of infrastructure, not a poet describing a sunset. A system built with that much structural detail doesn't tolerate small failures quietly. And that's exactly why a handful of stars showing up late isn't treated as a curiosity in the text. It's treated as a fracture in the one thing everything else depends on staying intact. But here's where the story stops being tidy, because Enoch doesn't just see one group of imprisoned stars. He sees two, and the difference between them is where this story gets genuinely uncomfortable. Later in his journey, in a separate and much darker location, Enoch describes seeing more captives. This time, it isn't 7 stars, it's an entire host, bound in a burning abyss so severe, he says he could not look at it directly without being terrified. And when he asks about these, the answer he gets is different, and worse. These aren't stars that were simply late. According to the text, these are the fallen angels, the ones who descended to earth, broke the boundary they were never supposed to cross, and fathered a corrupted, violent race that spread ruin across the world before the flood came to end it. Their imprisonment isn't a bureaucratic penalty for mistimed appearance. It's judgment for an active, deliberate rebellion, one that involved deceiving humanity, fathering something the text treats as an abomination, and unleashing violence that Enoch describes as staining the earth itself. The text is careful to separate the punishments too, and the difference in severity says almost as much as the crimes themselves. The 7 stars are bound in a place with no floor and no sky, desolate, but described almost like open confinement, a wasteland rather than active torment. The fallen host, by contrast, is described in a burning abyss so intense that Enoch says the sight of it terrified him, somewhere he could not look at directly. One punishment reads like detention. The other reads like a furnace with no bottom. That gap in severity is exactly why treating these as two versions of the same failure matters so much. If the text wanted you to see all of these bound beings as equally guilty, it had no reason to build two separate locations with two dramatically different intensities. The architecture of punishment is doing narrative work here, quietly ranking the crimes by how far they went, from a broken schedule all the way to a broken world. Here's the part that should stop you. In the language of this text, angels and stars are frequently described using the same imagery. Stars is, in places, functioning as another name for angelic beings, not a separate category of celestial object, which means the 7 stars imprisoned for arriving late and the host imprisoned for full-scale rebellion may not be two unrelated stories. They may be two different classes of the same catastrophe, sentenced to two different depths of the same prison. One group facing punishment for a failure of timing, the other for something the text treats as close to the worst act in its entire cosmology. If that's the correct reading, then the question of how late stops being trivial. A star arriving late in a system this rigid isn't a footnote. It might be the earliest, smallest sign of exactly the kind of breakdown that, left unaddressed, becomes the full rebellion described later in the same book. The text may be showing you the first crack before it shows you the collapse. And this is where the story stops being ancient history and starts being something people are still arguing about today. Because there's a separate detail buried elsewhere in the Enoch material: a number. The text describes a period of judgment measured in what it calls 70 generations, after which the situation is said to change. Scholars disagree sharply on what that number was ever meant to represent, and there is no scholarly consensus establishing a specific calendar date tied to it. This is speculative territory, not something the text spells out with a modern date attached. But the shape of the claim is what keeps drawing people back to it. A bound sentence, tied to a countable span of time, inside a text that insists the imprisoned have not yet been released. That's speculation, and it should be treated as speculation. The text itself doesn't hand you a release date. What it does hand you is a structural claim that a lot of readers miss entirely. An active prison, currently occupied, holding something the text describes as responsible for corrupting the order of the world once already. It's worth being honest about where the evidence actually stops, because that's exactly the point where most retellings of this story quietly start inventing things. The Book of Enoch does not name a modern year. It does not describe satellites, radio signals, or anything resembling 21st century technology. Anyone telling you it does is reading their own conclusion into a text that was never built to support it. What the text does give you is narrower, and in some ways stranger, precisely because it's more restrained. A closed system, a defined offense, a punishment with a stated but unspecified endpoint, and a repeated insistence across multiple sections of the same book that the story of the Watchers isn't finished. Enoch is told more than once that he is recording this specifically, so it can be read by people who come long after him. The text seems to expect a future reader. It just never tells that reader what year it's addressing. That gap between what the text claims and what people want it to mean is exactly why this story keeps resurfacing generation after generation. Every era that rediscovers Enoch tends to read its own anxieties into that empty space where a date should be, which says less about the ancient text and more about how badly every generation wants to know whether it's the one living at the edge of the story's ending. Which brings us back to where this started. 7 stars, bound at a place with no floor and no sky. punished for showing up late to their post. According to the very text that describes them, that debt has not been paid. Whatever they were part of, a small failure of order, or an early warning of something much larger, the story never says it ended. Enoch himself doesn't get the satisfaction of watching that sentence resolve either. He's shown the prison, told what it holds and why, and then he's moved on to the next region of the journey, the way you might be pulled away from a locked door just as you start to understand what's behind it. The text never brings him back to that spot. No later chapter shows the stars released, punished further, or explained any further than the single answer his guide already gave him. As far as the narrative itself is concerned, the door simply stays shut, and the story moves elsewhere. That absence is doing more work than a resolution would have. A finished story tells you the ending and lets you close the book. An unfinished one keeps a small, specific question sitting in the back of your mind indefinitely. Not a vague dread about ancient prophecy, but a narrow, concrete detail. 7 stars, still exactly where Enoch left them, waiting on a clock that was never given a face. It says it's still running.